The thing about monsters is that we prefer them simple. Evil for the sake of evil. Cruel without cause. We want them cartoonish, one-dimensional, easy to categorize and easier to condemn. But the truly dangerous men, the ones who almost change the course of history, are never that clean. They're brilliant and brutal, visionary and vindictive, capable of acts so noble they inspire poetry, and so monstrous they defy comprehension. They're men like Hannibal Barca, who spent his entire life trying to destroy Rome and came closer than anyone before or since. And the question we have to ask isn't whether he was great. He was. The question is, what kind of greatness requires that much darkness, that much sacrifice, that much unrelenting, generational hatred? We know the legend. The boy who swore an oath to his father at age 9 to be Rome's eternal enemy. The general who crossed the Alps with elephants, shattering every assumption about what was militarily possible. The tactical genius who annihilated Roman army after Roman army, killing more than 100,000 soldiers in battles so devastating that Roman mothers would frighten their children with his name for generations. Hannibal ad portas. Hannibal is at the gates. The ultimate nightmare. The man who almost broke the empire that would rule the world for 1,000 years. But that's the public story, the one they carved onto monuments and wrote into histories. What we need to examine is the private reality, the cost of that oath, the price of that brilliance, the moral compromises, the strategic cruelties, the calculated atrocities that made Hannibal not just a great general, but a force of nature so terrifying that Rome reshaped its entire military doctrine around the single goal of never facing another man like him. Because here's what the legend doesn't tell you. Hannibal didn't just fight Rome. He warped himself into a weapon against it. He turned his life, his body, his very soul into an instrument of revenge for a war his father lost before he was born. And in doing so, he became something neither wholly human nor entirely admirable. He became the thing he had to become to do what he did. And that transformation, that willingness to sacrifice everything, including his own humanity, on the altar of a single purpose, that's where the darkness lives. Let's start at the beginning. Carthage, 247 BC. Hamilcar Barca, Hannibal's father, is commanding Carthaginian forces in Sicily during the First Punic War. The war is going badly. Rome, a land power with barely any naval tradition, has somehow learned to build ships and fight at sea. They've beaten Carthage, the greatest maritime empire in the Mediterranean, in its own element. The humiliation is total. When the war ends, Carthage is forced to sue for peace. They pay an enormous indemnity. They lose Sicily, their richest province. And worse than the territorial loss, worse than the money, is the psychological wound. Carthage wasn't just defeated, it was exposed. The empire that controlled trade routes, that founded colonies from Spain to North Africa, that considered itself the natural master of the Mediterranean, had been beaten by agricultural Romans who barely knew how to navigate. Hamilcar never forgave them. And he raised his son to inherit that hatred. The story goes that when Hannibal was 9 years old, his father brought him to the temple before departing on a military expedition to Spain. There, in front of the altar, Hamilcar made young Hannibal swear an oath. Not allegiance to Carthage, not devotion to the gods, an oath of eternal hatred toward Rome, to never be its friend, to oppose it as long as he lived, to dedicate his existence to its destruction. Think about that for a moment. A 9-year-old boy, dragged to an altar by his father and programmed with a mission of revenge for a war he didn't fight, for a humiliation he didn't experience, for a geopolitical grievance that had nothing to do with him personally. That's not raising a son. That's forging a weapon. And Hamilcar didn't care about the cost because he wasn't going to be the one paying it. Hannibal was. And Hannibal paid. Oh, how he paid. He spent the next years in Spain with his father, learning warfare not from tutors, but from campaigns. He saw how Hamilcar conquered tribes, how he extracted resources, how he turned subjugated populations into revenue streams to fund Carthage's recovery. He learned that war wasn't glorious. It was logistical. It was about supply lines and silver mines and political alliances that could be bought or coerced. He learned that loyalty was a resource to be managed, that cruelty was a tool to be deployed strategically, and that mercy was a luxury only winners could afford. And he learned something else, something that would define his entire military career. He learned how to command men who had no reason to follow him except for what he could offer them. The Carthaginian army wasn't like the Roman legions. Rome had citizens who fought for the state, for glory, for land grants after service. Carthage had mercenaries. Iberians, Gauls, Numidians, Libyans, Greeks. Men who spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, fought for different reasons. Men who were there for pay, for plunder, for the promise of something better than whatever they'd left behind. Managing that coalition was a political and psychological feat as impressive as any battle Hannibal ever won. You couldn't appeal to patriotism with men who had no shared patria. You couldn't inspire them with nationalist rhetoric when they came from a dozen different nations. What you could do was win. Constantly. Convincingly. You could share the plunder fairly. You could fight beside them instead of behind them. You could earn their personal loyalty through demonstrated competence and shared hardship. And Hannibal did all of that. He learned the languages of his troops, not fluently, perhaps, but enough to speak to them directly, to give orders without translation, to make them feel seen. He wore the same armor they did, ate the same food, slept on the same ground. When the army marched, he marched. When they went hungry, he went hungry. He deliberately cultivated an image of himself as first among equals, rather than a distant aristocrat giving orders from a tent. This wasn't kindness, it was calculation. A multicultural mercenary army is inherently unstable. Tribal rivalries, language barriers, religious differences, all of these create fractures that can shatter an army from within. Hannibal had to be the center of gravity, the one thing everyone agreed on, the person they followed not because they had to, but because following him had proven profitable. And because abandoning him meant losing the only structure holding the coalition together. Think about what that required psychologically. To be constantly performing leadership, to never show weakness, never show doubt, never let the mask slip, because the moment it did, the moment his troops sensed hesitation or division or uncertainty, the whole thing could collapse. For 15 years in Italy, Hannibal had to be relentlessly present, relentlessly competent, relentlessly the person his army believed him to be. That kind of sustained performance doesn't leave room for a private self. It consumes you. You become the role you're playing because there's no space left for anything else. And maybe that's what Hannibal wanted. Maybe becoming the weapon was easier than being the person who'd been turned into one. When Hamilcar died, drowned crossing a river during a campaign, Hannibal's brother-in-law Hasdrubal took command. And when Hasdrubal was assassinated, the army, unprompted by Carthage, proclaimed Hannibal, at age 26, their general. Think about that. An entire professional army choosing a commander barely out of his 20s. That doesn't happen unless that man has already proven something extraordinary. Unless he's already earned their respect not through lineage, but through demonstrated capability and ruthlessness. Hannibal immediately began preparing for the war he'd been promised since childhood. Not defensive preparations, not fortifications or treaties, offensive preparations. He provoked Rome deliberately by attacking Saguntum, a Spanish city under Roman protection. He knew Rome would retaliate. He wanted them to, because he'd already planned what came next, the crossing of the Alps. Let's be clear about what this meant. No one had ever moved an army over the Alps. The terrain was impossible, the weather was lethal, the local tribes were hostile. And Hannibal wasn't bringing a light raiding party. He was bringing 40,000 infantry, 10,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. Not because it was the smart route. The smart route was by sea. But Rome controlled the Mediterranean. So Hannibal did the impossible, because the impossible was the only option left. The crossing took 15 days. 15 days of soldiers freezing, falling off cliffs, being picked off by mountain tribes, starving, dying. The elephants suffered horribly. Most of them didn't survive. Neither did half the army. By the time Hannibal descended into the Po Valley, he'd lost 20,000 men. 20,000. Before he'd even fought a battle. But he'd done the impossible. He'd appeared in Italy with an army when Rome thought he was still in Spain. He'd bypassed their naval dominance, outflanked their defensive strategy, and positioned himself on their homeland, where he could recruit from Rome's own subject allies who resented their subjugation. And that's when the killing started. The Battle of Trebia. Hannibal baited the Romans into crossing a freezing river, then ambushed them with cavalry hidden in the flanks. He slaughtered them. 16,000 Romans dead, 4,000 more captured. The Battle of Lake Trasimene. Hannibal lured the Roman army into a narrow defile between the lake and the hills, then sprung an ambush from the high ground. 15,000 Romans killed in the first 3 hours. Another 15,000 captured. The consul Flaminius was killed in the fighting. It was the largest ambush in military history. And then, Cannae. Oh, Cannae. August 2nd, 216 BC. Hannibal faced a Roman army of over 80,000 men, the largest force Rome had ever fielded. He had 50,000. The Romans were confident. How could they not be? They had numerical superiority, heavy infantry, and a straightforward plan. Crush Hannibal with overwhelming force. But Hannibal had been studying Roman tactics for years. He knew they fought in tight formations, pushing forward with discipline and mass. So he designed a trap. He put his weakest troops in the center, arranged in a convex formation that bulged toward the enemy. When the Romans attacked, the center gave way slowly, drawing the Romans deeper, while Hannibal's African heavy infantry on the flanks held firm. And then, when the Romans were fully committed, when they thought they were winning, Hannibal's cavalry, which had routed the Roman cavalry early in the battle, swung around and closed the trap from behind. The Romans were surrounded. All 80,000 of them, packed into a kill zone, unable to maneuver, unable to retreat, unable to do anything but die. And they did. 50,000 Romans killed in a single afternoon. Another 20,000 captured. The consul Paulus died fighting. The other consul, Varro, escaped, one of the few. It was the single bloodiest day in Roman military history, possibly in any military history before the Industrial Age. Hannibal sent the Senate a message after the battle. He filled 3 bushel baskets with gold rings stripped from the fingers of dead Roman senators and equestrians who'd fought at Cannae. 3 bushels of rings. Think about what that means. Not a letter, not a threat, just evidence. Proof of how thoroughly he'd dismantled Rome's leadership class. The aftermath of Cannae reveals something crucial about Hannibal's strategy and its fundamental flaw. One of his cavalry commanders, a man named Hannibal, came to him after the battle and said, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you don't know how to use one." He wanted Hannibal to march immediately on Rome, to appear before the gates while the city was still in shock, while panic ruled the streets, while resistance might crumble. He promised that within 5 days Hannibal would dine in the capital. But Hannibal said, no, not yet. First, he needed to consolidate his position, to secure his allies, to wait for Carthage to send reinforcements now that he'd proven the strategy could work. It was the prudent choice, the tactical choice, the choice a general makes when he's thinking about sustainability rather than gambles. And it was probably the wrong choice, because Rome didn't collapse. When news of Cannae reached the city, there was panic, yes. Grief, certainly. But there was also something else, something Hannibal hadn't accounted for because it wasn't part of Carthaginian culture. Stubborn, irrational, self-destructive refusal to quit. The Senate met. They banned public mourning because it would hurt morale. They refused to ransom the prisoners Hannibal had captured because that would reward him for taking them. They raised new legions from men too young or too old for normal service. They armed slaves and promised them freedom if they fought. They melted down temple decorations to mint coin for paying troops. And then they did something that defined Roman strategic culture for centuries. They sent armies everywhere except where Hannibal was. They sent legions to Spain to attack Carthaginian territories there, cutting off Hannibal's potential reinforcements and revenue. They sent fleets to raid North Africa, threatening Carthage itself. They sent troops to Sicily to suppress pro-Carthaginian uprisings. They turned the war into a multi-front conflict, forcing Carthage to defend everywhere, while Hannibal bled slowly in Italy with no support. It was brilliant, strategically brilliant. And it worked because Rome had something Carthage didn't: a political system that could sustain losses without fracturing. The Roman Republic wasn't run by a merchant oligarchy focused on profit and loss. It was run by a militarized aristocracy that measured status through military achievement and saw defeat as a challenge rather than a reason to cut losses. Hannibal had killed hundreds of thousands of Roman soldiers. He'd slaughtered them at Trebia, Trasimene, Cannae. He'd destroyed consul after consul, army after army. And Rome just kept raising more. They had a population of something like 4 million between the city and the Allied territories. They could afford losses that would break other states. But Carthage couldn't. Carthage was a trading empire, not a territorial one. Its wealth came from commerce, from ships, from colonies that produced goods for export. War was expensive. War disrupted trade. And a war that wasn't producing clear returns, that was draining resources year after year with no end in sight, that was politically unsustainable. And this is where we see the rot in Carthaginian politics, the dysfunction that doomed Hannibal before he ever crossed the Alps. The Carthaginian Senate was divided into factions. The Barcid faction, Hannibal's family, was militaristic, focused on land empire in Spain and revenge against Rome. But there was another faction, led by a man named Hanno, that opposed them. Hanno had argued against the war from the beginning. He thought Hannibal's provocations were reckless, that fighting Rome was suicide, that Carthage should focus on trade and avoid continental entanglements. And when the war started going badly, when it became clear that Hannibal couldn't take Rome itself, Hanno's faction gained power. They blocked reinforcements. They refused funding. They let Hannibal twist in the wind in Italy, winning battles that didn't matter because he didn't have the resources to convert tactical victories into strategic success. This wasn't just political infighting. It was sabotage, deliberate sabotage. Hanno and his allies would have preferred Hannibal to fail, to be defeated, because his defeat would discredit the Barcid faction and validate their opposition to the war. They cared more about domestic political advantage than about the general fighting for Carthage's survival in enemy territory. Imagine what that must have felt like for Hannibal. He was in Italy, sleeping on the ground with his men, rationing food, watching his army shrink from attrition, disease, desertion. He was winning every battle, outthinking every Roman general they sent against him. And back home, the people who were supposed to support him were actively undermining him because his success threatened their political position. The cruelty of that is almost unbearable. He'd given his life to the mission. He'd sworn an oath at 9 years old. He'd turned himself into a weapon. He'd crossed the Alps and done the impossible. And Carthage, the state he was fighting for, didn't care enough to send help. So what do you do in that situation? You keep fighting because you don't know how to stop. Because stopping would mean admitting the mission was futile. Because your entire identity is bound up in being the enemy of Rome. And if you're not that, what are you? And that's when the moral compromises start to compound. Because when you can't win cleanly, when you can't defeat your enemy through superior forces or decisive battles, you start using other tools. Darker tools. Tools that work through fear and degradation and the calculated infliction of suffering to achieve political objectives. Hannibal crucified Roman prisoners, not in anger, not spontaneously, but as deliberate policy. He would crucify them where Italian allies could see, where towns considering whether to support Rome or Carthage could witness what happened to those who fought for Rome. It was terrorism, calculated terrorism designed to break will and shift allegiance. He burned towns that resisted him, not just military targets, civilian populations, farms, vineyards, olive groves. He turned fertile land into wasteland, because if he couldn't control it, he wanted to make sure Rome couldn't profit from it either. Scorched earth, a tactic as old as warfare and as morally corrosive as any weapon ever devised. He used biological warfare, though he couldn't have called it that. He catapulted diseased corpses over city walls during sieges. He drove sick animals into besieged towns, hoping to spread plague. He contaminated water supplies. These weren't innovations. They were standard siege tactics in the ancient world. But that doesn't make them less horrific, doesn't make the suffering they caused less real. And he forced captured Romans to fight each other as gladiators. Not for entertainment in the traditional sense, but for morale. To keep his troops' spirits up during the long, grinding years when nothing was happening. When they were marching in circles in Italy, waiting for reinforcements that never came, he gave them spectacle, blood sport, the humiliation of their enemies as performance. These are documented. These are attested in multiple sources. And the question is whether these are the actions of a monster or the actions of a brilliant man trapped in an impossible situation, doing what he calculated was necessary to maintain his army's cohesion and pursue the mission he'd been given. The answer is both. They're both. He was brilliant, and he was monstrous. He was a victim of his father's programming, and he was a perpetrator of calculated atrocities. He was fighting for survival, and he was using tools that degraded his own humanity in the process. This is what happens when you turn a person into a weapon. The weapon works. It does what it was designed to do. But it can't be anything else. Can't choose a different path. Can't stop and say, this is too much. This violates something fundamental. Because stopping means breaking. And breaking means admitting that everything you've sacrificed was for nothing. Rome should have surrendered. Any rational calculation said the war was over. 3 major armies destroyed. Over 100,000 soldiers dead. The Italian allies defecting. The treasury depleted. But Rome didn't surrender. And that's where Hannibal's strategy started to unravel. Because Hannibal had made a fundamental miscalculation. He thought that if he inflicted enough pain, Rome's allies would abandon it, and Rome itself would sue for peace. He thought he could break their will. But he misunderstood Roman culture at the deepest level. Romans didn't surrender. Ever. They'd lost entire armies before and kept fighting. They'd been sacked by Gauls centuries earlier and rebuilt. Their entire identity was wrapped up in resilience, in never quitting, in outlasting any enemy through sheer, stubborn refusal to accept defeat. So instead of surrendering, Rome adapted. They stopped fighting Hannibal directly. They adopted what would later be called Fabian strategy, after the dictator Fabius who implemented it. They shadowed Hannibal's army, cut his supply lines, harassed his foragers, refused to give him the open battle he needed. They turned the war into an endurance contest, betting that they could outlast him. And they could, because Hannibal had a problem he couldn't solve. He was in Italy with an army, but he couldn't take Rome itself. He didn't have siege equipment. He didn't have enough men to invest the city. And Carthage wasn't sending reinforcements. The Carthaginian Senate was divided. Some factions supported Hannibal. Others resented the Barca family's military power and refused to fund what they saw as a personal vendetta. So Hannibal was stuck. He could win battles. He could raid the countryside. He could burn farms and slaughter livestock and terrorize the population. But he couldn't win the war. Not without reinforcements. Not without supplies. Not without political support from home. And this is where we start to see the moral degradation that comes from a war without end, a mission without completion, a purpose that can't be fulfilled. Hannibal stayed in Italy for 15 years. 15 years of marching and countermarching, of living off the land, of watching his army slowly bleed away from attrition, desertion, disease. 15 years of waiting for Carthage to send help that never came. 15 years of winning battles that didn't matter because the strategic situation never changed. Let's pause to understand what 15 years means. 15 years is longer than most marriages, longer than most careers. It's enough time for a child to grow into a teenager, for a young soldier to become middle-aged, for hope to curdle into desperation, and desperation to harden into the kind of grim endurance that's indistinguishable from living death. Hannibal's army changed during those years. The men who crossed the Alps with him, the veterans who'd won at Trebia and Trasimene and Cannae, they died. Some in battle, more from disease. Others deserted, slipping away in the night to go home or settle in Italy or just stop being soldiers. They were replaced by Italian recruits, by fresh mercenaries from Gaul, by men who hadn't shared the original vision, who didn't know what the oath meant, who were just there because an army needed soldiers, and soldiering paid. And Hannibal himself changed. The sources describe him aging rapidly during the Italian campaigns. His hair went gray. He lost an eye to some infection or injury that went untreated. He developed chronic pain, the kind that comes from years of sleeping on the ground and riding horses through all weather and never letting your body fully heal. But the physical aging was nothing compared to the psychological erosion. Because Hannibal wasn't just fighting a war, he was maintaining a performance. Every day he had to be the unbeatable general, the brilliant tactician, the man who'd crossed the Alps and shattered Rome's armies. He couldn't show doubt, couldn't show fear, couldn't let his troops see that he was increasingly aware that the war couldn't be won as long as Carthage refused to support him and Rome refused to surrender. That kind of sustained cognitive dissonance destroys people. Knowing that you're fighting for a lost cause, but being unable to admit it because admission means everything you've sacrificed was meaningless. So you keep fighting. You keep pretending. You keep telling yourself that reinforcements are coming, that the strategy will work, that next year Rome will finally break. And when the reinforcements don't come, when the years pile up with no change in the strategic situation, you start making choices you wouldn't have made when you still believed winning was possible. You start prioritizing survival over victory, maintaining the army over achieving objectives. You start doing things just to keep the machine running, even though the machine isn't going anywhere. During those years, he did things. Dark things. Necessary things, or so he told himself, things that revealed what happens when a brilliant man is trapped in an impossible situation with no good options. But here's the cruelest part. In 211 BC, 7 years after Cannae, Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal finally managed to bring reinforcements from Spain. He crossed the Alps with a fresh army, elephants, supplies, everything Hannibal needed to renew the offensive. They were supposed to meet in central Italy and combine their forces for a coordinated attack on Rome. But the Romans intercepted Hasdrubal at the Battle of the Metaurus River. They destroyed his army, killed him in the fighting. And then they did something calculated to break Hannibal psychologically. They took Hasdrubal's severed head and catapulted it into Hannibal's camp. Imagine receiving that message. Your brother's head, decomposing, landing in your camp. Not a letter explaining the defeat. Not a report from a survivor. Just the physical proof that the reinforcements you'd waited 7 years for weren't coming. That your brother, who'd risked everything to help you, was dead. That you were still alone. The sources say Hannibal wept. One of the only times he's recorded showing emotion. And then he buried his brother's head with honors and went back to the war. Because what else could he do? Stop? Give up? Admit that it was over? He couldn't. Psychologically, he couldn't. Because his entire identity, the meaning he'd constructed for his existence, was bound up in being Rome's enemy, in fulfilling the oath, in proving that his father's faith in him hadn't been misplaced. If he stopped, if he admitted defeat, he wouldn't just be a failed general. He'd be betraying everything that made him who he was. So he fought on. For another 6 years, without hope of reinforcement, without hope of victory. Just fighting, because fighting was what Hannibal did. Because the weapon couldn't lay itself down. Because the mission had consumed the man and there was nothing left to return to. And then, in 203 BC, Carthage finally recalled him. Not because they wanted to support him, but because Rome had done what Hannibal couldn't. They'd attacked Carthage directly. A Roman general named Publius Cornelius Scipio had invaded North Africa, defeated Carthaginian armies there, and was threatening the city itself. Suddenly, the Senate that had starved Hannibal of resources for 15 years needed him desperately to save them from the consequences of their own failure to support him. Hannibal sailed home. After 15 years in Italy, after losing his youth and his health, and arguably his humanity, in service of a mission that Carthage had abandoned, he returned to a city he barely remembered to fight a defensive war he'd never been trained for, against a Roman general who'd studied every battle he'd ever fought. That general was Scipio Africanus, and he deserves attention because he represents the Roman response to Hannibal, the evolution of Roman military thinking in direct response to the nightmare Hannibal had created. Scipio was young when Hannibal invaded. He'd been at Cannae. He'd survived when 50,000 others didn't. He'd watched his father and uncle die fighting Hannibal's brothers in Spain. And instead of being traumatized into helplessness, he'd done something remarkable. He'd studied Hannibal, obsessively. He'd analyzed every battle, every tactic, every strategic choice. And he'd learned. When Scipio was given command in Spain at age 25, which was absurdly young for a Roman general, he immediately started implementing Hannibalistic tactics. Surprise attacks, aggressive maneuvers, coordinated cavalry and infantry operations. He wasn't trying to fight like a traditional Roman general, grinding forward with heavy infantry. He was fighting like Hannibal, using speed and deception and the element of surprise to offset numerical or positional disadvantages. And it worked. He conquered Carthaginian Spain. He cut off Hannibal's supply lines. He built a reputation as the anti-Hannibal, the Roman general who could think like the enemy and beat them at their own game. And when he proposed invading North Africa, the Senate, desperate and terrified and willing to try anything, gave him permission. So when Hannibal finally returned to Carthage after 15 years abroad, he wasn't facing a conventional Roman general he could outthink. He was facing his own reflection, a younger version of himself, a man who'd weaponized the same tactical brilliance, the same aggressive vision, the same willingness to do the impossible in service of total victory. The Battle of Zama was scheduled like a duel. The two greatest generals of their generation meeting on a plain in North Africa to decide the fate of the Mediterranean. They met before the battle, the sources say, talked face to face. Two men who respected each other's abilities even as they prepared to try to kill each other. What did they say? The histories record diplomatic pleasantries, offers of peace that both knew would be rejected. But what did they actually say to each other? Did Hannibal see in Scipio the man he might have been if circumstances had been different? Did Scipio see in Hannibal what Rome's obsession with revenge and military glory might eventually turn its own generals into? We'll never know. What we know is that they fought, and Hannibal lost. His elephants, his traditional trump card, were countered by Scipio's troops, who opened lanes in their formation and let the elephants charge through harmlessly. His cavalry, once his decisive advantage, was outmaneuvered by Numidian horsemen who'd switched sides and were now fighting for Rome. His center, the Carthaginian citizen soldiers who were supposed to hold the line, broke under pressure. And when Hannibal tried to rally his veterans, the hardened mercenaries who'd fought with him in Italy, they found themselves in the same tactical trap he'd used at Cannae. Surrounded, enveloped, cut off. Scipio had studied Cannae so thoroughly that he used Hannibal's own masterpiece against him, the double envelopment. The tactical perfection Hannibal had invented became the mechanism of his defeat. It's almost poetic in its cruelty. The weapon turned against its creator, the student surpassing the master by becoming him. Hannibal survived the battle. He rode from the field, one of the few who did, and in what might be the most honest moment of his entire life, he advised the Carthaginian Senate to sue for peace. Not to keep fighting, not to raise another army, but to surrender, to accept defeat, to end the war on whatever terms Rome would offer. Because he understood, finally, that it was over. Not just the battle, not just the war, but the entire generational struggle. Carthage would pay a massive indemnity. It would surrender its war elephants. It would dismantle its fleet. It would agree to make no war without Rome's permission. Everything Hamilcar had feared, everything Hannibal had fought to prevent for his entire adult life, came to pass anyway. The oath had failed. The mission was impossible from the start. And Hannibal, at 45 years old, broken and exhausted, and probably half dead inside, had to face the reality that his father had programmed him for a task that couldn't be completed, that he'd turned himself into a weapon for nothing, that all the brilliance and suffering and sacrifice had accomplished exactly zero. He crucified prisoners to intimidate Roman allies into staying neutral, not as an act of rage, but as calculated psychological warfare. He burned towns that refused to support him, not all the inhabitants, just enough to make the point. He used biological warfare, catapulting corpses and diseased animals into besieged cities to spread plague. He forced captured Romans to fight each other as gladiators for the entertainment of his troops, to keep morale up during the grinding years of stalemate. These aren't legends. These are attested in historical sources. And the question we have to ask is, are these the actions of a monster? Or are they the actions of a man doing what he believed was necessary to accomplish the mission he'd been given before he was old enough to understand what it would cost? Because that's the thing about Hannibal. He never chose this war. It was chosen for him, by his father, by Carthaginian politics, by the oath he swore at 9 years old before he had the capacity to understand what it meant. And once he was in it, once he'd crossed the Alps and won at Cannae, once he'd committed everything to the destruction of Rome, what was he supposed to do? Quit? Go home? Admit that the mission was impossible? He couldn't. Not psychologically, not politically. His entire identity was wrapped up in being Rome's nemesis. If he stopped, if he abandoned the war, he wouldn't just be a failed general. He'd be betraying the oath, betraying his father's memory, betraying the meaning he'd constructed for his entire existence. So he kept fighting. Even when it was clear he couldn't win. Even when his army was reduced to a fraction of its original strength. Even when Carthage recalled him to defend the homeland against a Roman counter-invasion. He kept fighting because stopping would mean admitting that everything he'd sacrificed, all the men who died following him, the 15 years in Italy, the crossing of the Alps, all of it had been for nothing. The Romans invaded North Africa. It was a brilliant strategic move. Instead of trying to defeat Hannibal in Italy, they attacked Carthage directly, forcing Carthage to recall its greatest general to defend the homeland. Hannibal sailed back after 15 years abroad, returning to a city he barely remembered, to fight a defensive war he'd never trained for, against a Roman general named Scipio, who'd studied all of Hannibal's tactics and adapted them. The Battle of Zama, 202 BC. Hannibal's elephants, his trump card, were countered by Scipio's troops, who opened lanes in their formation and let the elephants charge through harmlessly. Hannibal's cavalry, once his decisive advantage, was outmaneuvered by Numidian horsemen fighting for Rome. And when it came down to infantry, Scipio used Hannibal's own tactics against him. The double envelopment he'd perfected at Cannae, turning Hannibal's masterpiece into his own defeat. Hannibal survived the battle. He rode from the field and advised the Carthaginian Senate to sue for peace, because he understood, finally, that the war was lost. Not the battle, the war, the whole generational struggle. Carthage would pay a massive indemnity. It would disarm. It would become a client state of Rome. Everything Hamilcar had feared, everything Hannibal had fought to prevent, came to pass anyway. And Hannibal? He didn't retire. He couldn't. Because what does a weapon do when the war is over? It doesn't have a peacetime function. It can't transition to civilian life. It can only rust or find a new war. Hannibal tried politics. He got himself elected as suffete, essentially a chief magistrate of Carthage, and he tried to reform the corrupt oligarchy that had betrayed him. He investigated the finances, exposed embezzlement, tried to reorganize the state to pay off the war indemnity without crushing the poor. He was good at it, competent, maybe even visionary in his understanding of what Carthage needed to survive. But the oligarchs he was investigating hated him. They'd profited from the war, from selling supplies to the army at inflated prices, from currency manipulation, from all the ways elites extract wealth during crises. And now Hannibal, the military hero who'd failed to save them, was threatening their wealth and power. So they did what Carthaginian elites always did when threatened. They betrayed him to Rome. They sent reports to the Roman Senate claiming that Hannibal was secretly plotting rebellion, that he was in communication with Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire, that he was planning another war. None of it was true, or at least, not yet. But Rome didn't care whether it was true. They just wanted Hannibal gone. Roman ambassadors arrived in Carthage to arrest him, not to negotiate, not to verify the accusations, just to arrest him. Because even in defeat, even disarmed and powerless, Hannibal terrified Rome. His name still had power. His existence was a rebuke to their victory. As long as he lived, Rome couldn't fully celebrate, couldn't fully move on, couldn't convince itself that the nightmare was really over. Hannibal fled. At 50 years old, he became a fugitive. He slipped out of Carthage in the night and made his way to the Seleucid court, where King Antiochus was planning a war against Roman expansion in the east. Hannibal offered his services as a military advisor. Think about what that means. The greatest general of his age, the man who'd nearly broken Rome, reduced to being a consultant. Not commanding armies, not leading campaigns, just giving advice that might or might not be taken. Watching younger men implement strategies he knew better than they did. Forced to be grateful for scraps of influence and position. Antiochus listened to Hannibal's advice, sometimes, but not when it mattered. Hannibal told him to invade Italy directly, to open a second front that would stretch Rome's resources. Antiochus ignored him and fought in Greece instead. Hannibal told him how to position his fleet for naval engagements. Antiochus used different tactics. And when the Seleucid Empire faced Rome at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC, Antiochus lost catastrophically. Hannibal wasn't even at the battle. They'd given him a small naval command, a minor role that kept him away from the main action. Maybe they didn't trust him. Maybe they were afraid that if he achieved another great victory, he'd overshadow them. Maybe they just didn't understand what they had. When Antiochus sued for peace, one of Rome's conditions was that he hand over Hannibal. Rome didn't want money, didn't want territory. They wanted Hannibal. Even now, even after he'd failed, after his army was gone, after his country was defeated, they still wanted him. Because symbols matter more than reality sometimes. And Hannibal was the symbol of everything that had ever threatened Rome. So Hannibal fled again, to Crete, where he had some gold hidden, then to Armenia, then to Bithynia in northern Anatolia, where a small king named Prusias gave him refuge. And there, in a fort by the sea, Hannibal spent his final years. He was in his 60s by then, old for the ancient world, old for a man who'd spent his life at war. His health was broken. He had chronic pain from old injuries. His blind eye probably hurt constantly. He couldn't ride horses anymore, couldn't march with troops, could barely walk some days. But he still planned. He couldn't stop. He helped King Prusias with minor military campaigns. He designed a fort with multiple escape tunnels because he knew Rome would find him eventually. He spent his time thinking about battles he'd never fight, campaigns he'd never lead, strategies for a war that was over. And in 183 BC, Roman ambassadors arrived in Bithynia. They demanded that King Prusias hand over Hannibal. Prusias, who'd promised protection, who'd taken Hannibal's advice and benefited from his expertise, caved immediately. Of course he did. You don't refuse Rome, not if you want to keep your kingdom. Hannibal was in his fort when the Roman soldiers arrived. He tried to escape through one of his secret tunnels, but they were all guarded. They'd anticipated him. They'd studied his tactics, his tendency toward strategic depth, his habit of always having a backup plan. They'd learned from him even in the act of capturing him. When he realized there was no escape, Hannibal took poison. He'd carried it with him for years, probably, a final escape route that couldn't be blocked. He drank it and died within minutes, denying Rome the satisfaction of parading him through the streets, of making an example of him, of humiliating him the way they'd humiliated other captured enemies. His last words, according to the historian Livy, were bitter and defiant. Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death. Even in death, he was thinking about Rome. Even at the end, alone in a foreign country, hunted like an animal, betrayed by everyone who'd claimed to be his ally, he still defined himself in opposition to them. Not as a Carthaginian statesman, not as a military theorist, not as a reformer or advisor or anything else he might have become, just as Rome's enemy. Always and only Rome's enemy. Because that's what he'd been made into. A weapon. A living curse. A man who existed for a single purpose and couldn't imagine himself outside of it. The oath his father made him swear at 9 years old had consumed his entire existence. And even when the mission was impossible, even when Carthage had abandoned him and the war was lost and he was old and broken and alone, he still couldn't let it go. That's the tragedy. Not that he failed. Failure was probably inevitable, given Carthage's political dysfunction and Rome's demographic advantages. The tragedy is that he couldn't stop trying. Couldn't accept that some missions can't be completed, that some oaths shouldn't have been sworn, that sometimes the only wise choice is to admit that the purpose you've been given is destroying you, and walk away. But Hannibal couldn't walk away. Because walking away would mean his entire life had been meaningless. All the suffering, all the sacrifice, all the moral compromises, all of it would have been for nothing if he just stopped and became someone else. So he kept being Hannibal Barca, Rome's enemy, until the poison stopped his heart and released him from the only identity he'd ever been allowed to have. Scipio Africanus died the same year, 183 BC. The two greatest generals of their generation, dying within months of each other. Scipio had his own problems by then. He'd been accused of embezzlement, of taking bribes, of profiting from his victories. The charges were probably false, but Roman politics were vicious, and success made you a target. He'd retired to his country estate, bitter and disillusioned, and died there feeling unappreciated. Two brilliant men, two weapons forged by their cultures for war, both discarded when they were no longer useful. That's what empires do to their champions. They use them, and then they throw them away. And the only difference is that Scipio got to die in his own country, while Hannibal died in exile. But here's the darkest irony. Hannibal's death didn't end anything. Didn't solve Rome's Carthage problem. Because Rome had learned something from Hannibal. They'd learned to be afraid. Permanently, existentially afraid of what Carthage might become if given another chance. Cato the Elder, a Roman senator, ended every speech he gave with the same phrase. Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. It didn't matter what the speech was about. Agricultural policy, tax reform, Senate procedure. Every single time he ended with that phrase, Carthage must be destroyed. And in 146 BC, 60 years after Hannibal's death, Rome did it. The Third Punic War was a war of annihilation. Carthage hadn't attacked anyone, hadn't broken any treaties, hadn't threatened Rome in any way. But Rome picked a fight anyway, using a minor treaty violation as pretext, because Cato and the war faction had convinced the Senate that Carthage's mere existence was an unacceptable risk. The siege lasted 3 years. The Carthaginians defended desperately, knowing that surrender meant extermination. They made weapons from melted-down jewelry. They tore up their ships to build siege defenses. Women cut their hair to make rope for catapults. They fought street by street, house by house, until the city was nothing but rubble and corpses. When Rome finally breached the walls, they killed or enslaved everyone. Everyone. 50,000 people sold into slavery. The city burned for 17 days, And when the fires finally died, the Romans plowed the ruins with salt so nothing would grow there again. They wanted to erase Carthage from existence, to make it so complete that future generations wouldn't even remember where it had stood. That's what Hannibal's brilliance bought Carthage. Not survival, not security, but paranoia so deep that Rome couldn't rest until Carthage was ashes. His victories at Trebia and Trasimene and Cannae, his crossing of the Alps, his 15 years in Italy terrorizing Roman territory, all of it made Rome so afraid that they eventually annihilated the entire civilization just to ensure it could never produce another Hannibal. So in the end, Hannibal didn't save Carthage. He doomed it. His father's oath didn't preserve Carthaginian independence. It guaranteed Carthage's eventual extermination. The mission was worse than futile. It was counterproductive. Every victory brought Carthage closer to the Holocaust that would consume it 2 generations later. And that's the final, crushing irony of Hannibal Barca's life. Everything he did, all the brilliance, all the sacrifice, all the moral compromises, all the suffering he inflicted and endured, accomplished the exact opposite of its intended purpose. He wanted to destroy Rome and save Carthage. He failed to destroy Rome and ensured Carthage's destruction. You could argue that he was simply unlucky, that if Carthage had supported him, if reinforcements had arrived after Cannae, if his brother Hasdrubal had gotten through, if any number of contingencies had broken differently, he might have won. And you'd be right. History hinges on details, on coincidences, on decisions that seem minor at the time, but cascade into completely different futures. But that's not the full story. Because even if Hannibal had taken Rome, even if he'd burned the Senate house and salted their fields and killed every Roman citizen, what would that have accomplished except creating another Rome out of Carthage? Another empire built on conquest and slavery and the systematic exploitation of subject peoples. The problem wasn't that Hannibal failed. The problem was the mission itself, the oath, the generational hatred, the idea that revenge is a valid foundation for existence, that you can program a child to hate, that turning a human being into a weapon is acceptable if the cause is righteous enough. Hamilcar broke his son when he made him swear that oath. Not intentionally, maybe with love, maybe believing he was giving Hannibal purpose, a noble mission, a chance at greatness. But he broke him nonetheless. He turned a 9-year-old boy into a machine for revenge and set him on a path that could only end in death or madness, or the kind of bitter, hollow survival that's barely distinguishable from either. And Hannibal became what he was made to become. He fulfilled the oath. He was Rome's eternal enemy. He never befriended them, never made peace with them, never stopped opposing them. He did exactly what his father demanded, and it destroyed him, destroyed his country, and accomplished nothing except proving that revenge is a poison that kills everyone who touches it. So was Hannibal great? Yes, unquestionably. He was one of the greatest military minds in history. His tactics are still studied in war colleges. His strategic vision, his logistical genius, his ability to inspire loyalty in a multicultural mercenary army for over a decade far from home. These are extraordinary achievements. But was he good? That's harder. He killed tens of thousands of people. He devastated the Italian countryside for 15 years. He crucified prisoners. He used terror as a weapon. He sacrificed his own soldiers in battles he knew he couldn't win because surrender wasn't psychologically available to him. He turned his life into a monument to hatred, and everyone around him paid the price. And yet, he was also a victim. A child programmed for revenge before he understood what revenge meant. A general given an impossible mission and no support. A brilliant mind trapped in a strategic situation with no exit. a man who might have been something entirely different if his father hadn't dragged him to that altar and made him swear an oath he spent his life fulfilling. That's the moral complexity of Hannibal. He was shaped by forces beyond his control, and he made choices within those constraints that were often monstrous. He was both perpetrator and victim, both genius and monster, both tragic hero and cautionary tale. And Rome never forgot him. They built their entire military system around the memory of Cannae. They developed new tactics, new organizational structures, new strategic doctrines, all designed to ensure they would never be vulnerable to another Hannibal. In a very real sense, Hannibal created the Roman military machine that would conquer the known world. He was the trial by fire that forged the empire. But here's the darkest irony. Carthage was destroyed anyway. 60 years after Hannibal's death, Rome picked a fight with Carthage over a minor treaty violation, the Third Punic War. It was a war of annihilation. Rome besieged Carthage for 3 years, then burned it to the ground. They killed or enslaved every inhabitant. They plowed the fields with salt so nothing would grow. Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. Cato the Elder ended every speech in the Roman Senate with those words, no matter the topic. And eventually, they did it. They erased Carthage from existence, not because it was a threat anymore, but because Hannibal had made them so afraid that they couldn't let Carthage survive. So in the end, Hannibal's war of revenge didn't save Carthage. It doomed it. His brilliance made Rome paranoid enough that they couldn't tolerate Carthage's existence even in weakened form. His father's oath didn't preserve Carthaginian independence. It guaranteed its eventual extermination. And that's the final tragedy of Hannibal Barca. Everything he did, all the brilliance, all the sacrifice, all the cruelty, all the suffering he inflicted and endured, it accomplished the exact opposite of its purpose. He wanted to destroy Rome and save Carthage. He failed to destroy Rome and ensured Carthage's destruction. You could argue he was simply a product of his time, that we can't judge ancient commanders by modern moral standards, that every great general in history has blood on their hands. And you'd be right. But that's not the full story. Because Hannibal wasn't just a general. He was a man who turned himself into an instrument of revenge so thoroughly that he lost the capacity to be anything else. There's a Roman account, probably apocryphal but psychologically revealing, of Hannibal meeting Scipio years after Zama. They were both older, both out of power, both exiles in their own ways. And Scipio asked Hannibal who he thought was the greatest general in history. Hannibal said Alexander, then Pyrrhus, then himself. Scipio, annoyed, asked what Hannibal would have said if he'd won at Zama, and Hannibal replied, "Then I would put myself before Alexander." Even in defeat, even years later, he was still thinking about rankings, about legacy, about whether his greatness would be remembered. That's what the oath did to him. It turned him into a man who couldn't see himself except through the lens of comparison to others, through the measure of victories and defeats, through the eternal question of whether he'd fulfilled his purpose. And he hadn't. He knew he hadn't, and that knowledge poisoned the rest of his life. So when we remember Hannibal, when we study his tactics and admire his genius and tell stories about the man who almost broke Rome, we should also remember the cost to the people he killed, the cost to his own soldiers who followed him for years in a war that couldn't be won, the cost to Carthage, which was destroyed in part because he made Rome too afraid to let it survive, and the cost to himself, a child programmed with hatred who became exactly what his father designed him to be, and lost any chance of being anything else. But let's go deeper into what those costs actually mean. Because it's easy to say, there were costs, without really confronting what that means in human terms, in real suffering, in lives destroyed and futures erased. Start with the soldiers who followed him. We know the numbers from the major battles: 16,000 dead at Trebia, 30,000 at Trasimene, 50,000 at Cannae. Those are just the Roman casualties. Hannibal's armies suffered losses too, though the sources are less clear about the exact numbers. Maybe 10,000 dead across those same battles, maybe more. But those numbers are abstractions. Each one was a person, a man with a name, a family, a life before the war. The Gallic warrior who died in the cold waters of the Trebia had probably been recruited with promises of plunder, of adventure, of a chance to fight the Romans who'd been pressing into his tribal lands. He didn't know when he joined that he'd drown in a freezing river in a country he'd never heard of, fighting for a cause he didn't understand. The Numidian cavalryman who took a Roman spear at Cannae had probably been riding horses since he was old enough to walk. He'd joined Hannibal's cavalry because that's what young men from his tribe did, because it was honorable, because the pay was good.
He died in the dust of an Italian plain, far from the deserts of North Africa, bleeding out while the battle raged around him.
Did he think about home as he died? About the family he'd never see again? About the life he might have had if he'd stayed? Multiply that by tens of thousands. By hundreds of thousands, if you count the entire war. Every casualty was someone's son, often someone's father, someone's brother, husband, friend. And their deaths didn't just end their own stories, they rippled outward. Families left without providers, children who grew up fatherless, women who became widows and had to survive in societies that barely recognized their existence outside of marriage. And that's just the soldiers. What about the civilians? The Italian farmers whose fields Hannibal's army trampled, the towns he burned, the people he enslaved to fund his operations, or crucified to make political points. There's a moment that haunts the historical record, barely mentioned but morally devastating. After the Battle of Cannae, when Hannibal had tens of thousands of Roman prisoners, he offered to ransom them back to Rome. The price wasn't even that high. But the Roman Senate refused, not because they couldn't afford it, but because they'd decided as policy not to reward Hannibal for taking prisoners. So what happened to those prisoners? Some were sold into slavery. Some were forced to fight as gladiators for the entertainment of Hannibal's troops. Some probably just died from disease or exposure or despair in the prisoner camps. And their families in Rome had to live with knowing that their sons or husbands or fathers were alive somewhere, suffering, and the state had chosen not to save them as a matter of principle. That's the cost of strategic thinking. When human beings become chess pieces in a larger game, when policy overrides compassion, when the mission matters more than the people it's theoretically supposed to serve. Both sides did it. Hannibal used prisoners as leverage. Rome refused to be leveraged, and 20,000 men paid the price for that abstract standoff with their freedom and probably their lives. And then there are the costs that compound over generations. Italy was devastated by 15 years of Hannibal's armies marching through it. Farms were destroyed, vineyards and olive groves were burned, infrastructure collapsed. The economic damage took decades to recover from, and some regions never did. But more than the physical damage was the psychological scar. Romans who lived through the Second Punic War, who'd seen their armies destroyed, their allies defect, their very survival threatened, they passed that trauma to their children. They told stories about Hannibal. They used his name to frighten misbehaving kids. They taught their children that security was an illusion, that strength was the only protection, that you could never be safe enough, never powerful enough, never
ruthless enough. And that generational trauma shaped Roman culture for centuries. It's part of why Rome became so militaristic, so expansionist, so committed to total victory rather than negotiated peace. Because they'd learned from Hannibal that leaving an enemy alive, leaving them with any capacity to recover and strike back, was an existential risk. So when they fought for annihilation. Look at the Third Punic War. By 146 BC, Carthage was barely a shadow of what it had been. It was disarmed, economically weak, politically subordinate to Rome. It posed no realistic threat. But Rome destroyed it anyway, burned it to ashes, and plowed the ruins with salt. Why? Because Hannibal had taught them to be afraid. And fear, once established, doesn't respond to rational calculation. It just seeks to eliminate the source, no matter how much overkill is required. So Hannibal's brilliance didn't just destroy Carthage. It poisoned Roman culture, making them more brutal, more paranoid, more willing to pursue total war as standard operating procedure. The mercy Rome might have shown to defeated enemies, the kind of negotiated peace that allows civilizations to survive defeat, that became unthinkable because Hannibal had demonstrated what a defeated enemy could accomplish if given a second chance. That's a cost we don't usually calculate. Not what Hannibal did directly, but what his actions caused others to do in response. The ratcheting up of violence, the normalization of annihilation as policy, the lesson that teaching your enemies to fear you so thoroughly that they can never allow you to survive. And then there's the cost to the idea of greatness itself. Because Hannibal is remembered as great. He's in the pantheon of military genius alongside Alexander and Caesar and Napoleon. Military academies study his tactics. Historians write books analyzing his campaigns. He's become an icon of strategic brilliance, of doing the impossible, of nearly defeating an empire that would rule the world for centuries. But what does it mean to call someone great when their greatness consists of killing efficiently? When their brilliance was deployed in service of revenge? When their greatest achievements were battles where tens of thousands of people died so that one general could prove his tactical superiority? Greatness used to mean something moral. Plato and Aristotle thought great men were virtuous men, that excellence of character mattered as much as excellence of skill. But military greatness, the kind we assign to Hannibal, is amoral. It's measured in victories and innovations, and the magnitude of what was accomplished, regardless of whether what was accomplished was good. And that's dangerous, because it teaches us to admire capability divorced from purpose, to celebrate brilliance without asking what the brilliance was for, to study tactics without examining whether the strategic goals were just, whether the costs were proportionate, whether the whole enterprise was worth the rivers of blood it required. Hannibal was brilliant, unquestionably. His tactical innovations influenced warfare for millennia. His strategic vision was extraordinary. His ability to maintain a multicultural army in enemy territory for 15 years was a feat of leadership that few generals in history could match. But he used all that brilliance in service of an oath sworn by a child too young to understand what he was swearing. In service of revenge for a war he didn't fight. In service of destroying Rome, not because Rome was uniquely evil, though it could be brutal, but because destroying Rome was the mission his father had programmed into him. And when the mission failed, when it became clear that Carthage wouldn't support him and Rome wouldn't surrender, he kept going anyway. Not because continuing might lead to victory, but because stopping would mean admitting that his entire life had been wasted on an impossible task. So he ground himself down to nothing, sacrificed his humanity, did things that would haunt any conscience that hadn't been killed by necessity, all to avoid facing the truth that the oath was a mistake, and his father had broken him before he was old enough to resist. That's not greatness. That's tragedy. It's the waste of extraordinary potential in service of a fundamentally flawed purpose. It's what happens when someone with the capacity to change history gets pointed at the wrong target and lacks either the wisdom or the permission to redirect. Could Hannibal have been something else? Could he have used his tactical genius to reform Carthage's military? To defend it without pursuing generational revenge? Could he have become a statesman, a reformer, someone who made Carthage stronger internally instead of exhausting it in futile wars against superior enemies? Maybe. We'll never know. Because the oath closed off those possibilities before Hannibal was old enough to explore them. He was set on a path at 9 years old, and that path led inexorably to elephants and Alps and Cannae, and 15 years of grinding futility and eventual exile and poison in a foreign fort. And what did it accomplish? Rome survived. Grew stronger, in fact, because surviving Hannibal gave them a mythic narrative of resilience and a justified paranoia that fueled their expansion. Carthage was destroyed, erased so thoroughly that we only know its history through Roman sources, through the accounts of its enemies. And Hannibal himself died alone, hunted, reduced from the greatest general of his age to a fugitive advisor no one fully trusted. So when we study Hannibal in military academies, when we analyze his double envelopment at Cannae and his crossing of the Alps and his ability to win battles against superior numbers, we should also study what those victories meant. Not just tactically, but humanly, morally, strategically. We should ask whether brilliance in service of revenge is admirable or cautionary, whether teaching a child to hate, to dedicate their life to destruction, is acceptable even if the child grows up to be extraordinarily good at it, whether turning a human being into a weapon is justified by the mission, or whether the mission itself needs to be questioned before we celebrate the weapon's effectiveness. Because the alternative is to teach generations of future leaders that Hannibal's path is one to emulate, that swearing oaths of eternal hatred is noble, that pursuing revenge regardless of cost is honorable, that brilliance excuses brutality as long as the cause is framed as just. And if that's what we take from Hannibal's story, then we've learned exactly the wrong lesson. We've mistaken tragedy for triumph. We've confused the waste of potential with the fulfillment of it. We've celebrated a man who was broken by his father's oath and never recovered enough to become anything other than what he was made to be. That's the shadow of greatness. That's what it looks like when brilliance is yoked to darkness, when tactical genius serves strategic obsession, when a man of extraordinary gifts uses them all in service of a mission that destroys everything he touches, including himself. And the saddest part? Hannibal probably knew. At some level, especially in those final years when he was running from court to court, when he was old and broken and the war was long lost, he probably understood that the oath was a curse, that his father had damaged him, that his entire life had been spent fulfilling a mission that should never have been imposed on a 9-year-old child. But understanding doesn't grant freedom. Knowing you're trapped doesn't open the trap. And by the time Hannibal might have had the wisdom to walk away from the oath, to say that he'd done enough, that the mission was impossible, that he deserved to be something other than Rome's eternal enemy, it was too late. His identity was too thoroughly welded to the mission. Walking away would have been psychological suicide, so he kept going until literal suicide was the only escape left. That's what happens when you program a child for revenge.
You don't create a hero. You create a machine that can't stop until it's destroyed. And everyone touched by that machine, friend and enemy alike, pays the price for the oath someone else swore before they were born. Hannibal Barca, the man who crossed the Alps, the general who won at Cannae.
The sworn enemy of Rome who spent his life trying to destroy it and died alone in exile, having accomplished nothing but the guarantee of his own civilization's annihilation. History calls him great, and he was. But greatness is not the same as goodness. And sometimes the greatest men are the ones who do the most harm, not despite their brilliance, but because of it. Because they're capable enough to turn their obsessions into reality, disciplined enough to pursue them without wavering, and committed enough to pay any price, inflict any suffering, sacrifice any principle in service of the mission they were given before they were old enough to choose. That's Hannibal. That's the legacy. Not just the tactical brilliance, though that was real, not just the strategic vision, though that existed, but the demonstration of what happens when a human being is turned into a weapon, pointed at an enemy, and told that their entire purpose is destruction. He almost broke Rome. But in the process, he broke himself, broke his soldiers, broke his country, and broke any chance of the world remembering him as anything other than the eternal enemy, the nightmare at the gates, the genius who dedicated everything to hatred and died having accomplished nothing but perpetuating the cycle of violence that destroyed both sides. Hannibal ad portas. Hannibal is at the gates. That's what Roman mothers told their children to frighten them, and it worked for centuries. Long after Hannibal was dead, long after Carthage was ashes, long after everyone who'd fought in the Punic Wars was gone, the name still carried power, still meant danger, still represented the thing that almost destroyed them. And maybe that's the only victory Hannibal ever won. Not on the battlefield, not in the strategic sense, but in the psychological one. He made Rome afraid, permanently, existentially, so afraid that they reshaped their entire civilization around ensuring it never happened again. So afraid that they couldn't sleep easy until Carthage was erased from existence. But victory through trauma isn't really victory. It's just another form of mutual destruction. Rome won the war, but lost something in the process. They became harder, more brutal, more committed to annihilation as policy. Hannibal made them into something closer to what he was, a machine for conquest and violence that couldn't stop until it had consumed everything within reach. And in that sense, maybe Hannibal did change Rome, not by defeating it, but by infecting it with his own pathology, by teaching it that mercy was weakness, that negotiated peace was vulnerability, that the only safe enemy was a dead enemy. Rome learned those lessons so well that they applied them everywhere, turning the Mediterranean into a graveyard of civilizations that might have survived if Rome hadn't learned from Hannibal to be so afraid. Carthage, obviously, but also the Greeks, the Gauls, the Egyptians, the Judeans. Every culture Rome encountered after the Punic Wars faced a choice: submit completely or be destroyed utterly. The middle ground, the possibility of coexistence between powers, that died somewhere in the 15 years Hannibal spent terrorizing Italy. So in a twisted way, Hannibal's spirit conquered Rome, even though his armies didn't. He made them into a reflection of himself, a civilization built on discipline and violence and the willingness to sacrifice anything, including its own values, in service of security and dominance. That's a dark legacy. Not the one history celebrates when it talks about Hannibal's genius, but maybe the truest one. The man who almost broke Rome instead broke something in Rome, turning the republic that might have developed into something different into the empire that would eventually collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. And what about us? What should we learn from Hannibal's life, if we're honest enough to look past the tactics and the legend and the dramatic narrative of the man who almost won? We should learn that oaths sworn in childhood are chains, not purposes. That programming a child for revenge is child abuse, regardless of how noble the cause is framed. That turning human beings into weapons is a crime against their humanity, even when the weapons are effective. We should learn that brilliance without moral grounding is dangerous. That tactical genius in service of strategic futility is just sophisticated waste. That winning battles doesn't mean anything if the war itself shouldn't be fought. We should learn that revenge is poison. That it consumes everyone who touches it. That dedicating your life to destruction, even righteous destruction of genuine enemies, leaves you hollowed out and incapable of being anything else. That hatred, even justified hatred, is a poor foundation for existence. And we should learn that the costs of greatness are paid mostly by other people. The soldiers who die in battles they don't understand. The civilians whose lives are destroyed by armies marching through. The civilizations that get erased because one man's brilliance made his enemies too afraid to let them survive. The children programmed for missions they never chose. Hannibal didn't choose his oath. He was 9 years old. He didn't understand geopolitics or strategy or the nature of revenge. He just wanted his father's approval, and his father made that approval contingent on swearing to hate, to fight, to dedicate his existence to Rome's destruction. That's not agency. That's grooming. And the fact that Hannibal grew up to be extraordinarily good at the mission doesn't validate the mission. It just proves that human potential is malleable, that you can shape a child into almost anything if you start early enough and push hard enough. And that we should be horrified by that rather than impressed. Because for every Hannibal who becomes a military genius, how many children are broken by similar oaths and never recover? How many sons are programmed for revenge who lack the brilliance to make it impressive and just become bitter, violent, dysfunctional adults? How many daughters are taught to dedicate their lives to causes they didn't choose and spend their existence serving purposes that destroy them? The damage isn't in the exceptional cases. It's in the pattern. The normalization of using children as instruments for parental grievances. The acceptance of oaths and missions and programming that override individual agency and autonomy. The celebration of dedication that's actually just the inability to escape your conditioning. Hannibal should be a cautionary tale, not a hero. Not an icon of greatness, but a warning about what happens when we value capability over consent, when we mistake trauma bonding for loyalty, when we program children for purposes and then celebrate when the programming works. That's not the legacy military academies teach. They teach the tactics, the double envelopment, the crossing of the Alps, the brilliant use of terrain and timing and psychological warfare. And those are worth studying, understanding how Hannibal thought, how he solved problems, how he turned disadvantages into advantages. That's valuable knowledge. But it's incomplete knowledge if it doesn't also include the cost. The human cost, the moral cost, the civilizational cost. The cost to Hannibal himself, who spent his entire life being what his father made him, instead of discovering what he might have chosen to become. And in the end, that's the saddest part of Hannibal's story. Not that he failed, not that Rome survived and Carthage was destroyed, but that we'll never know who Hannibal might have been if his father hadn't broken him, if the oath had never been sworn, if a 9-year-old boy had been allowed to be a child instead of being forged into a weapon. Maybe he would have been a reformer. Maybe he would have used his brilliance to transform Carthage's political system,
to make it more resilient, more democratic, more capable of surviving contact with Rome's expansion. Maybe he would have been a builder instead of a destroyer, a creator instead of an annihilator. Or maybe he would have been none of those things. Maybe he would have been ordinary, a merchant, a sailor, a husband and father living a quiet life of trade and family and small joys that don't make it into history books. And maybe that would have been better. For him, for the hundreds of thousands who died in his wars, for Carthage, for Rome, for everyone. That's not the legacy he wanted.
But it's the one he got.
The eternal enemy. The genius who almost won. The man who became such a perfect weapon that he couldn't be anything else. The shadow that loomed over Rome even in death. And in the end, maybe that's all any of us become. Not what we wanted, not what we hoped, but what we made ourselves into through the choices we made and the missions we accepted. Hannibal accepted his mission at 9 years old before he could understand it, and he fulfilled it perfectly, becoming exactly what his father designed, paying exactly the price that kind of perfection demands. The man who almost broke Rome, but who broke himself first. That's Hannibal Barca. That's the shadow of his greatness. That's what it costs to turn a human being into history. And the cost is always, always higher than the glory suggests.